A very good morning, evening, wherever you are, whenever you're seeing this. We have a fantastic panel today speaking about the topic that everybody seems to be interested in, which is electrification in the mobility sector. And we have a fantastic panel here, starting with Akshima Ghate. She's a senior principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and Akshima and I have known each other for now over a decade, and it's great to have you here, Akshima. Thanks for joining in. Also with us is Mr. Anirban Ghosh. He's the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Mahindra Group. Good to have you, Anirban. With us is Ravin Mirchandani as well. He's the Executive Chairman of the Adore India Group. And finally, we have from the Ola Mobility Institute, Shilpi Samantre. She's a senior manager looking into this sector of electrification. So thank you all for joining us. And let me jump right in. And I'd like to start with Anirban. You've been in this sector of mobility for a very long time and with one of the oldest industrial houses in the country, the Mahindra Group. The question that I have to you is, electrification is touted as the solution for climate change, but to a large degree, the topic is also vis-a-vis the idea that electric cars are going to solve the problems of the future. At least that's what the imagination of people seems to be. And I would say a car is a car is a car. And what if I suggest that an electric car is essentially like a Diet Coke? Sounds good, but isn't that great for the health of our world?
Right, that's the first. Electric car as Diet Coke. I haven't heard that one before. But that's an interesting concept. It really isn't Diet Coke. It's not like you're taking the sugar out of the Coke and offering the same. It's completely different. I don't know if you had the chance to drive an electric car. It's actually a much better vehicle to drive. If you forget about the climate for a while, you will buy the car because it is a much better solution compared to a transportation solution compared to an IC engine vehicle. If for you a car is a car, no problem. This is a nicer car. If you love automobiles, you love this even more. So just wait for the electric cars to come, the real good ones, and you'll see that this is an awesome solution. That it solves the or makes a big contribution to solving the climate problem. Sometimes you can look at it as a very big bonus. And you when you began, you reminded me of something that the Energy Transition Commission says: electrify everything and decarbonize electricity. That's the biggest lever you have for deep decarbonization.
Thanks a lot for that. Maybe I'll still continue on that line for a moment, and I completely get the point that an electric car is better than an ICE car, at least from an emissions perspective. But isn't and I'd like to move to Shilpi now. Isn't electrification essentially an efficiency measure? So yes, it's a good energy transition measure, but it reduces emissions per vehicle kilometer traveled, not necessarily vehicle kilometers traveled themselves. And possibly the number of vehicle kilometers traveled might continue to increase as it has in the past, and hence the emissions themselves might increase. And so the question to you is, and because the Ola Mobility Institute looks at a wide array of issues, shouldn't our focus be on reducing vehicle kilometers traveled and a shift to walking and cycling, which are the only zero emissions modes, really, and to public transport? Over to you, Shilpi.
Uh, yeah, so thank you for that question, Shreya. So I would like to, the transport sector accounts for around 13% of the country's energy related CO2 emissions, with road transport accounting for around 90% of the sector's energy consumption. So, I mean, given the transport sector is such a big contributor, any steps taken to mitigate it will have a positive impact on the environment. And powering EVs with clean fuel will definitely add clean kilometers on road, supporting in reducing the emissions and in and in helping in decarbonizing the transport sector. So I would like to talk a little bit about vehicular emissions and how EVs are helping to reduce that emission. So to test if a vehicle is clean, vehicular emissions can be measured at two levels. First, direct emissions. Second, emissions across the life cycle of the vehicle. Direct emissions include emissions from the tailpipe and other vehicular operations, whereas life cycle emissions include emissions across life cycle of the vehicle and the fuel source. While vehicle manufacturing adds to the carbon emissions, conventional ICE vehicles add to it further with tailpipe emissions, which is not in the case of electric vehicles. So EVs are inherently more energy efficient than ICE vehicles. And when I say energy efficiency, it is the amount of energy from the fuel source that is converted into actual energy for powering the wheels of the vehicles. Um, in an EV, around 60% of electrical energy from the grid goes into turning the wheels, whereas in an ICE vehicle, it converts only about 17 to 20% of energy from burning fuel into moving to the vehicles. So EVs is 3 times more energy efficient than ICE vehicles, and hence requires less energy for operations compared to the ICE vehicles. Um, I mean, another aspect that I would like to highlight here is, with the threat to climate change growing, customers also demand to know about the source of the goods that they consume, and act responsibly through the purchase of sustainable products. In the EV domain too, this is the reality. Manufacturers on their part can insist on sustainable ways of production, recycling, and urban mining, which allows rare earth metals to be recovered from discarded batteries and other electrical and electronic equipments. So a holistic approach which integrates the problem of electronic waste management and paucity of raw materials will together go a long way to make India's indigenous supply chain of EV manufacturing stronger.
Thanks, Shilpi. I think we'll get back to this question of efficiency versus effectiveness. As Peter Drucker famously said, he's one of the foremost gurus. He said, efficiency is doing things right, but effectiveness is doing the right things. And it seems like, and therefore, maybe we should be asking ourselves, what is the effective thing to do, even within electrification, rather than just purely focusing on the efficiency question? Because we might be, for all you know, doing the wrong thing the right way, rather than doing the right thing the right way. And with that, I'd like to segue into a question for Akshima. And you've been in this policy space for EVs, electrification in India, working very closely with Niti Aayog as well as the government of Maharashtra. And one of the programs, the foremost programs of electrification is FAME, right? In FAME, as we saw, especially with the second round of FAME, we had, rightly so, the focus was on electrification of buses and of two-wheelers and three-wheelers, especially in the shared space. Now, having said that, and this policy seems to be a great step in the right direction, they have been teething troubles. There's been the uptake has been slow. The implementation has been not easy for cities across the country. What do you think is happening right now, and what could be done to fix this?
Thanks, Shreya. Thanks. It's a great question. I think I agree with you. There have been teething troubles, but the good news is that things are just turning around completely, and I think we would see significant change, particularly in the third year of FAME. Already, the numbers are kind of showing us that, which is as many of you would know, we were targeting an uptake of almost close to 5,000 buses. Original sanction was 7,000. And this year, we are almost close to 1,000 buses. So, and why I say this is a turnaround is because initially we did not, for the first 2 years, did not see like uptake of almost any buses. So now suddenly from no buses to 1,000 is a big leapfrog. And what we're also expecting is that most likely the next year there will be almost close to 3,000 electric buses. So overall, I would say that's the good news. Hopefully we've gone through that phase of teething troubles to a place now where we can say that the scheme is taking off. The same thing is now being witnessed in two-wheeler sales for a long time. What the numbers were. We're almost touching on, to close to almost 1 lakh sales of electric two-wheelers in this year. So just looking at how things have been with FAME, I think we've taken a good amount of 2 years to figure out how to kind of, get the scheme rolling in terms of sales, in terms of utilization. So I do not worry so much about now FAME 2 getting utilized or not on the vehicle side, but I think my worry essentially is now on the charging infrastructure side. We have a huge outlay of money out there, which is about 1,000 crore rupees to have charging infrastructure in cities, on highways, and that as of now is completely unutilized, which is speaking really of the capacity of the discoms and the cities to be able to utilize. So the question is not about money being on table or not. Money is there, government support is there. There, the challenge essentially is about capacity, which could, it even goes, to the issues of reforms, to, upgradation of upstream infrastructure, some of age-old regulations that need to be attended to, along with the institutional capacity. So I think we kind of getting over the vehicle part, but charging infrastructure is what I feel perhaps FAME 2 needs to give significant attention to.
Thanks, Akshima. Maybe I'll get back to you again on the question of what the gaps were and what are the learnings. How was the FAME 2 scheme? Sort of how did the turnaround happen? But for now, I'd like to move to our last but not least panelist, Mr. Ravin Mirchandani. You are from the ADOR group, a private sector group which is involved in the electrification ecosystem. I'd like to ask you, what do you think is the role of private sector in fixing the gaps? We clearly presently are not quite ready for a full-fledged rollout. What could the private sector do to make this happen?
Thank you very much, Shreya. Very good question. Before I jump in to answer the question you asked, I want to go back 2 questions ago when we talked about zero emissions and bicycling being the only form of transport that can be zero emissions. I want to state that actually technology is changing really quickly today. And hydrogen transport, for example, allows you zero emissions where your emissions are only water, and uses 1/10 the amount of lithium that you do in a present battery electric vehicle. So there's many forms of transportation today that are zero emission. And the reality is, the exploration of the world happened because people are traveling. So we can't control. We have to facilitate travel, but do so in a way that is not pillaging the planet and still allowing us to breathe clean air. The private sector, of course, has a very big part to play. The problem with where we are at in India today, and then we can talk globally, is that we do not have the economies of scale in anything, and China has the economies of scale in everything. So whether it's manufacturing lithium batteries, buying lithium or rare earth minerals such as magnesium, cobalt that go into a battery, or whether it's to make electrical chargers, or all sorts of equipment such as electric motors, the economies of scales do not exist here. So the first thing that we have to promote is developing ecosystems in India, whether it's battery manufacturing, electric drivetrain manufacturing, electric charger manufacturing, that allows us to, as a private industry, to participate in the sector, to facilitate a move from hydrocarbon-related mobility to electric-related mobility and eventually hydrogen mobility. We have today a mentality where everything is government-driven because that's where the capital can be spent. But when you do that, you have an L1, cheapest price-related mentality, and that means that, again, India cannot compete because India does not have the economies of scale to be able to compete with the Chinese product. So we need a policy-related change to allow for private industry to play in a big way. But without private industry, and Air India is a perfect example of that, private industry formed it and private industry will buy it. Without private industry, this sector will go not very far. You cannot rely entirely on government spending. Having said that, I think we also need to think about what our standards are going to be. Today, we have a multitude of standards. We have the Chinese GBT charging standard. We have CCS2 from Europe. We have CHAdeMO from Japan. We have the Indian standard, which is an iteration of China, which we call DC001 or AC001. And we do need to conglomerate. So the focus of government is policy to allow then private industry to have a focus on where to put its money so that we can allow for the faster adoption of electric mobility in India.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot for that. Your point about the government setting the policy and the private sector doing things is well taken. Having said that, oftentimes the private sector looks for government investment, though it's not just purely a policy regime, right? So the private sector management is necessarily looking for public sector subsidies for the private sector to take off. And maybe that's where I'd again go back to Anirban. What kind of policy support do you see government providing? And why should government be providing such, one, policy support? And are you expecting any financial support as well for the EV transition to happen?
I'll take 2 steps back and introduce a couple of concepts, because without that, this conversation doesn't go forward.
Sure.
The first thing I want, Ravin, this business of bicycles and cars. There's a data point which the bicycle mayor of Mumbai keeps using all the time, that almost 3/4 of the journeys that people make are less than 5 kilometers. And she's devoted her life to get cycling going because of this one data point.
Mm-hmm.
If we could get cycling going, it would be awesome. The more cycling we can get going, the better it is, both for the environment and for health and for people and so on. But I don't want to get into all the reasons why. Even if I want to cycle to office, which is 9 kilometers away, and I love cycling, why is it a big problem here while it is not one in Amsterdam? Let me get to your question about subsidies and business and growing the business and so on. Every industry goes through a phase of incubation, every new technology. This incubation period can last as long as 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
The electric mobility industry is already some 15 years into its incubation period. We bought Reva 10 years ago, where it was already some 5 years old or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look back, this technology space has been trundling along. If we leave it alone, a time will come when the new technology will offer superior value to the consumer and stand on its own feet.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason why this conversation on subsidies and government support is happening is because we need to accelerate the movement of this technology and accelerate the adoption of this technology. So there is an S curve that every technology follows, and the left tail of the S curve is very long. So we've got to cut that short. If you want to cut that short, then you've got to make the value proposition of the solution viable for the average consumer like you and me. Ask the question, why are you and me not running out to buy electric vehicles today? What's getting in the way?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we ensure that the innovators, the guys who are willing to take the initial risk, how do we get them in quickly? Because the faster they come, the quicker this solution, the clean mobility solution, can become economically viable and attractive, perhaps even use the word sexy for the consumer. And then we will not need any subsidies or policy support or anything. If you look at how policy support has triggered electric mobility in Norway and UK, for example, they started with a very high subsidy. In fact, I remember in one conversation I was telling the minister from Norway that if you give that much subsidy for our electric cars, the car would be free. But as the uptake of electric vehicles increased, they pared down the subsidy because people had started buying on their own. So India is on that journey now. And climate is an interesting conversation where businesses talk about government action and governments talk about market forces. It's a very interesting conversation. And if you attend these conversations at the COP or the Climate Week, you'll find it very interesting. You find the business person talking about uh, government support and the government person turning around and saying market forces should rule. But at the end of the day, we are trying to solve the problem of decarbonization. One tool is to accelerate the adoption of clean technologies. To accelerate the adoption of clean technologies, there is a period when the technology is not economically superior to the existing technology. So that bridge time is when we need public support, and that's the reason. Not because the companies want to put the responsibility of growing the industry on the government or anything like that. I hope I was able to address your question.
Sure, that was a good response. I'll move back to you, Akshima. You've been in the in the forefront of helping governments draft their electric mobility policy as being distinct from an electric vehicle policy. In the past, we've had many states which have had EV policies, but not necessarily an EM policy. Would you like to tell our viewers how you differentiate between an EV policy versus an EM policy, and what's the right EM policy for India?
Right. Thanks, Shreya. Thanks, Anirban, also for putting it, everything in the context of deep decarbonization. I think just Shreya, just kind of detouring a little from your question first and reacting to that. I think I'm also a strong believer for deep decarbonization. Technology per se will have a critical role to play. But I think overall, I also want to put forth what Shreya started with. I think we have to remember that there are three strong levers for deep decarbonization. One is demand reduction, second is modal shifts, and third is technology. And when we're talking about vehicle efficiency and adoption of zero emission vehicles, where all our electric, hydrogen technologies would fit in. And if we are really serious about deep decarbonization, I think we'll have to pay equal attention to all three. And I know I do not want to present any modeling results, but a key simple lesson that at least is the takeaway is that electrification will have a strong role, but an equally important role as shifting freight to railways would be, shifting people to buses and metros would be, shifting people or asking people not to travel and making your cities compact. This is, we're talking about, we have that huge opportunity of still adding 300 million people and shaping our state, shaping and reshaping our cities. And I think that's really the point that we've been trying to do as an organization in terms of thinking on electric vehicle policy. Rightly said, so Shreya. I think when we started, what we've seen as a country in terms of the subnational policies, which is essentially Karnataka and Maharashtra, 2017-18 period, but essentially EV manufacturing policies. I think that has been the period when we've looked at EVs as an opportunity for industrial growth, for setting manufacturing, creating jobs, but not as a mobility solution. It's only recently when we were like, okay, yeah, it's actually part of the mobility solution. We're not trying to, it's really not adding vehicles. It's about, servicing people. So I think that's what has been a big shift from what we have seen, even in FAME. In some of these policies, we just, work very closely with Maharashtra government to take their policy from being an EV manufacturing policy to be an electric mobility policy, where really, it is about electrifying vehicle kilometers. It's about shared transportation, etc. But beyond that, it is also about low emission zones within the cities. It is about non-fiscal incentives. It is kind of using also electric mobility as an instrument to shape to some extent the cities or states' mobility vision. We're kind of currently working in Pune and trying to bring this element that electric mobility can also help mobilize and catalyze some of the not so attended mobility action in the cities today. So just to kind of conclude my remark, I am seeing electric mobility as a huge opportunity for us to bring back attention also to public transportation, which kind of has been lost. And because suddenly cities, states are excited about electric buses. So I think we have to build on this momentum and like, okay, we need to build public transport and rather be, clean public transportation. So electric mobility really for me is giving us that and really helping us move closer to the decarbonization goal that we have.
Thanks a lot, Takshima, for that. And like Anirban was saying earlier, you told the Norway minister that if that kind of subsidy was given, then cars could be free. And I would say if that kind of subsidy was given, public transport could be free for everyone. And maybe we don't even need cars. I'll get back to you, but the next chance is that of Shilpi. Shilpi, Ola Mobility Institute has an arm's length distance from its parent body, Ola, but you have also studied what Ola does or what the business of shared mobility is. Could you share some light or shed some light on what direction do you think Indian cities should take as it vis-a-vis shared mobility? And especially given how the national government has shown a clear direction saying they would like to focus more on two-wheeler and three-wheeler based shared mobility. Do you have something to add on that?
The energy transition must be backed by a strong and holistic approach to policy making by governments. And so, I mean, before I delve into this mobility transition, I would like to start with how transitions in the past used to be. So, when automobiles were launched in 1880s, they were expensive. They were used by the rich only. Within 30 years, the first mass production of vehicle happened, and this pushed the number of cars owning households in the US from 8% in 1918 to 60% in 1928. This was not a linear growth, but an exponential growth. And we have seen similar exponential growth happening time and again throughout history, be it from horse carriages to cars or landline phones to mobile phones. Each time it has fundamentally changed the way we live and operate. So our race to electric mobility transition and to other cleaner mode of transport is not different in any other way. It needs to be backed by a holistic policy which can help in designing a fit for purpose solution in an equitable manner to cater to the country's mobility needs. And therefore, we should begin by making electric vehicles for all and not EVs as electric cars alone that can be afforded by a select section of the population. So, electrifying shared mobility, public transport, hyperlocal deliveries, etc., is the need of the hour. And considering two-wheelers are dominant vehicle category on the road, electrifying them is very crucial. And businesses in India today are already producing world-class two-wheelers at affordable prices. A study done by Ola Mobility Institute shows that the bike taxis in India have the potential to create over 2 million livelihood opportunities and a revenue of around 4 to 5 billion US dollars. And we need to endeavor towards high utilization vehicle segments like electric bike taxis to ensure that we do not add to the carbon emissions. And this should definitely happen in a just manner where we ensure that we are not only considering the benefits, but we are also keeping an eye out for risk and accordingly mitigating them. So the policy should maximize the benefits and minimize the risk that the EV transition possesses for the existing businesses, industries, communities, and workers. So I would like to conclude by saying that a bottom-up approach is recommended for EV transition, where policies do not look at the broader economic trends, but they consider the perspective of end users, industry workers, and then they slowly move up the pyramid by keeping the risk and benefit in mind at each layer.
Sure, thanks. Thanks a lot for also that data that you presented early on, where you spoke about how from there being no cars, there were a significant percentage of people having cars in the US. But one piece of statistic which is not typically also spoken about along with it is the exponential growth in road deaths, right? So, while the number of cars increased and a lot of people had access to cars, it also killed a lot of people. And that's certainly not the direction that we want to go in, right? And one of the concerns that I would like to bring to the table is that at the end of the day, a car is a car is a car. Yes, it might have improved emissions, but it can, if our future is still a car-oriented future, we're not necessarily mitigating other concerns of car usage, such as road safety, such as the amount of road space that is required, and whether we are getting mobility or not, because a lot of people are stuck in congestion. Like 4 of the top 10 cities, most congested cities, according to TomTom, are in India. And therefore, we need to be considering also these other factors, and it cannot be purely about vehicle technology alone. With that, I'll again go back to Anirban. You had raised your hand and you wanted to say something, and I'd like you to present your point of view.
Yeah, this conversation so interesting that points keep coming in my mind, and I'm wondering what came in my mind then. But let me pick up the broad theme of public transport and cars. While we talk of clean mobility and electrification of transport, maybe the biggest ones we don't talk of at all. One is the electrification of railways. We've all been on these diesel engine drawn trains, and the rate at which they are converting them to electric. And I'm wondering if Akshima and RMI have a hand in that. It's a fantastic thing to do. Similarly, Akshima has already talked about buses. And I grew up in Calcutta. We took 20 years to build 16 kilometers of a metro. And you look at what's happening now across the country, there's a profusion of metro lines. And they're being built at a rapid pace. Nothing could be better than that. In fact, sometimes in Delhi, I'm able to not get into a taxi or a car and use a metro and to get wherever I want to. There are some cities in the world you can't drag me into a car or a taxi. I'm very happy using a metro or public transport because it's possible. Now, it's not easy to retrofit metros into congested cities. But one of the things which I, as a user of public transport, think is a bit problematic is getting to a metro and then from the metro getting to wherever we need to get to. I don't know what solutions we'll arrive at. Maybe there'll be small electric vehicles doing the connections. But unless we get those connections right, we won't get people out of cars into the metros. We might get a lot of people out of the local train into the metro, out of the bus into the metro. But will we get people to leave their car at home or even bring their car, park it and get into a metro? I don't know. I just don't find the configuration to be something that is making it convenient as of now. A question you're raising over and over again, Shreya, is will the future be car oriented? I'm afraid that answer has been provided some 30 years ago in the way we have built our urban agglomerations, and continues to be answered every day in the haphazard, higgledy-piggledy manner in which residential areas become urban. Forget about our big cities. If you see how the small ones are growing, I don't know how we will be able to use public transport in the small cities. So one of my Mungeri Lal ke Haseen Sapnes was this, that we know that every small town is going to grow 3 to 4 times in the next 30 years. Instead of all of them growing in that haphazard manner, why don't we put a boundary line and say within this boundary you do whatever you were doing before, but outside this boundary, 3 times the size of the existing city, let's build it in a way in which we can do transit-oriented design. There is another phrase that goes into sustainable urbanization, transit-oriented mixed-use design. Let's make sure that people can walk, people can cycle, that there are metros and all of that. So 3 times the size of existing urbanization is the potential that we have. I don't know whether we'll be able to do it. If we are not, yes, the future will be car-oriented, and we'll have to do the best with that as we can.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that. And I really appreciate the fact that you brought the idea that a lot needs to be done in urban planning, not just like you mentioned about doing urban planning in surrounding the existing cities. And I would go a step further and say you can actually do urban planning even within our existing city boundaries. We should not be writing off our cities because our cities still have a lot of potential. And if you see two flagship programs that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs launched last year were called the Cycles for Change and the Streets for People. And incidentally, I had a role to play in launching these two programs to help over 100 Indian cities create streets which are safe and fun for everyone to walk and cycle. And a lot of them have actually started building these kinds of streets and starting to make our existing city centers, which for a lot of people have been written off, into actually walking and cycling havens. So I would write it off right now. And also, an excellent point that you bring about is that we should be also considering what is it that we're going to do in the new cities that are going to come around our existing cities, right? These are not new cities somewhere in the green field, but these are cities which are an expansion of our existing cities. Let me now again go back to Ravin Mirchandani. You had spoken about public sector, the ecosystem that is required, and that ecosystem being presently missing in India. What do you think? What is one ask if you were to ask the government of India, one ask to make sure that the private sector can do what it does best to help in the transition to electric mobility?
I run a podcast on electric mobility, and I ask that question every time I speak to people. And the interesting thing is every sector has a different ask. Everyone, from vehicle OEMs to grid electricity suppliers, power manufacturers, and charge point operators. And so you'll get a myriad of things. And I can give you an agglomeration of them, but I'll try and focus it down to something quite simple, because it's a frivolous question, but it always creates a very, very, very clear answer for most people you ask it to. And if you allow me 30 seconds just to digress, because some time ago you talked about how capitalism in India is almost seeking a crutch from government and always wanting funding from government. And it is in fact a disease that we have in India. Everybody wants funding from government to be able to do something. And I'd say, first up, funding from government should only come to create a level playing field. Not to create an industry. So if there is a level playing field that does not exist because China, for example, funds something or subsidizes something, or some other country does something that creates a problem for Indian industry to be competitive, then let's create something for a level playing field. And any funding, whether it's PLI, whether it's in any sector, should be, what do I do to give you, industry, capitalism, private industry, a level playing field to be able to compete, and then go out and be the best in the world. Mahindra has shown, Tata has shown, we can make a vehicle in India that is one of the best in the world, right? An XUV 700, XUV 500 is a coveted piece of kit in Australia and South Africa today. And the same with the Tata Nexon. Why not other industries in India? So I'd say my first ask would be, fund only a level playing field. The second ask I'd have, you asked me for one, but I think there's more than one that needs to happen. The second one is walk away from L1. And L1 is, the lowest cost becomes a mentality right across India, whether it's private industry, government industry. We can't help ourselves but buy the cheapest and then buy it again 12 months later and then buy it again 12 months later. And we pay 3 times over, but we never do the whole of life costing. And as a country, we need to walk away from that. We need to walk away from rewarding the cheapest, because you never get the best. You never get what's best fit for India. And if you want Indian industry to be able to be the best in the world, then we need to reward it for being the best in the world. There's very few parts of our economy that do that. For example, ISRO would do that. The airlines would do that. We don't buy the cheapest. We buy what is the best, because that's what's needed to get to where we need to get to. And as a country, we need to move. And that comes to the education system, that comes to policy, that comes to regulations, that comes to the way the economy works, that comes to private industry's own philosophies. But it is a trickle down that takes 10 years to get to. So I'd say those are the two asks I would recommend that private industry requires.
Sure. Thanks a lot. And we are now almost towards the end of the session. So I'd like each one of you to take exactly 1 minute, 60 seconds for your final comments. And I'll start with Akshima.
I think I'm gonna just react on the point that was being made on urban planning and public transportation. I think the problem really lies in the fact that today public transportation, and in fact mobility generally, the way we would want it, is really an afterthought. We would develop our developments, and I'm right now in one of these areas like Noida or Greater Noida, these kind of urban agglomeration. Public transportation here is really an afterthought. And share to your point on cars being the future, people have no choice. You have this dream of owning a home, you kind of get an affordable home on a fringe of a city, of a capital city like NCR. And sure, this is happening in smaller towns. You move away from the city, there is no public transportation. What is my choice? It's the tuk-tuks, or I get onto that shared, and I kind of if I can afford that, or if I can afford a two-wheeler, I will buy a two-wheeler, or I'll buy a car. I think so. The problem, yes, is interlinked so much with the fact that how our cities are growing and how they will grow. Second point, I really want to kind of re-emphasize the fact that, to me, it's, electric mobility is really, it should be looked as an opportunity. That is now in front of us. How we leverage it to activate even some of the other levers of our sustainable mobility paradigm is up to us. Whether it's around public transportation, whether it is around demand reduction in the form of use of more non-motorized transportation, I think we have to use it as an opportunity and build that momentum that overall we really can think of transportation contributing, if at all, to decarbonization of the economy.
Thank you. Shilpi?
So our race to e-mobility transition needs to be backed by holistic policies, which can help in designing fit-for-purpose solutions in an equitable manner to cater the country's mobility needs. And so policy support for EVs need to break the silos and have holistic framework in place for cradle to grave, like demand creation, end of life management, R&D, etc. But the focus should also be on the lifeline of the sector, which is the charging infrastructure network. So that will help us in moving towards a clean ecosystem.
Sure, thanks. Ravin?
My closing comments will be, I'm filled with hope for the future. Yeah, this is one of those moments when 100 years ago, there was a report in the City of London on the horses creating a manure crisis and how this is going to be, unlivable in cities in 20 years. And when you look at that kind of moment and you see where electric vehicles are taking us, I think I'm filled with hope, not because of electric vehicles, but because of zero emission vehicles and what that means for our planet, what that means for the fresh air that we will have in our cities. We are in your classic phase, as Anirban has said, right at the start of innovation, where you have a lot of things bubbling and a lot of confusion and a lot of energy being wasted in different directions. But eventually it will get channeled into the right directions for not just India, but for the world. Electric vehicles missed the boat in 1914 when they were 50-50 with ICE, and Henry Ford came up with the Model T, and the internal combustion engine took over. 110 years later, we have the opportunity to reclaim that and give our cities the clean air. And I'm filled with hope for it. I think this can only be a good thing.
And final words to you, Anirban.
So we're all trying to solve a big problem. The good news is that we know what the solutions are. I think all stakeholders should get together and do what is necessary to get the solutions implemented now. Lots of things are happening. There are many irons in the fire. We've got to scale it up. I know India is committed to be net neutral by 2070. That's on the basis of the models made today. I believe things will accelerate, that many solutions will become more viable faster than we think that they will become viable. So let's all go for it. And since we know that these are the right things to do, let's not hold back anymore.
And just a one-word answer. Would Mahindra Group make EV buses their focus in the future?
I don't know whether we are good at making buses. We've never made them. If we
There
make
were
EV
electric vehicles
buses, they
either.
may not be as good as some other people's buses, and you would want the best buses on the street. So I think each of us should do the best that we can and bring the best products that we can. I'm not ruling out electric buses. We've got a little business there with trucks and buses. Maybe we'll become good at that in the future. But at this point in time, if you want to lay your bets, lay it on the big bus guys.
Sounds good. With that, we come to an end of this fantastic session that we had with 4 excellent panelists. I'm hopeful of the future. And like Akshima said, electrification is an important aspect for a future which is clean and green. But it cannot be just about electrification. We also need to look at reduction in travel and also a shift to better mobility modes, walking, cycling, and public transport. With that, we come to an end. Thank you.